Most people believe reality is something solid, something fixed, something already decided before they even wake up in the morning. They believe life happens to them, around them, sometimes against them, and so they spend their days trying to push harder, think smarter, manifest louder, control outcomes more precisely. But what if the very act of trying is what keeps everything the same? What if reality isn't resisting you at all, but faithfully responding to how you're observing it? This is where the observer effect quietly enters the conversation. Not as a theory, not as a spiritual metaphor, but as a mechanism that explains why so many people feel stuck in invisible loops. Repeating the same patterns in relationships, finances, health, and self-worth. No matter how much effort they apply, the observer effect suggests something deeply unsettling and deeply empowering at the same time. Reality does not simply unfold in front of you. It organizes itself around the quality of your observation. Let me introduce you to someone who didn't realize this for most of his life. His name is Michael. He's 38, lives in Austin, Texas, and works as a project manager in tech. From the outside, his life looks stable. Good job, decent income, no obvious crises. But internally, he feels like he's running on a treadmill that never speeds up and never stops. Every year looks like a slightly updated version of the last. New goals, same tension, new intentions, same outcomes. Michael has tried everything he was told would create change. Productivity systems, morning routines, meditation apps, visualization exercises. He's read the books, watched the videos, repeated the affirmations, and yet nothing truly shifts. The same stress returns, the same doubt creeps in. The same quiet frustration settles into his chest each night when the house goes silent and his mind refuses to follow. What Michael doesn't realize yet is that he isn't failing to change his life. He's successfully repeating it. And he's doing it through unconscious observation. Every morning, before his feet touch the floor, his body is already tense. His breath is shallow, fast, contained in his upper chest. His mind scans the day ahead, anticipating problems before they exist. Emails, deadlines, conversations that might go wrong. And in that moment, long before any action takes place, something critical happens. A version of reality begins to collapse into form. Not because of what he does, but because of how he's observing. This is the part most people miss. Observation is not passive. It is not neutral. In quantum physics, the observer effect demonstrates that particles exist as waves of probability until they are observed. The moment observation occurs, those possibilities collapse into a single outcome. Awareness changes behavior. Measurement changes reality. And while this was first discovered in laboratories, its implications extend far beyond physics experiments, because your life is not separate from this principle. It operates under it. Every thought you carry, every expectation you hold, every emotional lens through which you view your circumstances acts as a form of observation. And when that observation is charged with fear, urgency, or control, reality organizes itself accordingly, not to punish you, not to test you, but to remain coherent with the signal you're broadcasting. Michael believes he's observing facts, his workload, his bank balance, his responsibilities. But in truth, he's observing through a conditioned nervous system, through a breath that never fully lands, through a body that never feels safe enough to pause. And so, his reality remains familiar, predictable, stable in the most limiting way. One evening, after another long day that felt identical to the 100 before it, Michael doesn't meditate. He doesn't journal. He doesn't plan. He simply sits on the edge of his bed and exhales. For the first time in a long while, he doesn't try to change anything. He notices his breath without adjusting it, notices the tightness in his chest without fixing it, notices the restless thoughts without chasing them. Something subtle happens, not dramatic, not mystical, but real. For a brief moment, he isn't reacting to his life. He's witnessing it. This is the threshold most people never cross. The moment when observation becomes conscious, when you're no longer trapped inside the stream of thoughts and emotions, but standing just behind them, aware. And in that space, the observer effect stops being a concept and starts becoming an experience. Because the truth is this: reality doesn't change when you force it. It changes when the observer changes, when awareness shifts from unconscious repetition to conscious presence, when attention moves from survival to coherence, when the way you look becomes more important than what you're looking at. Michael doesn't know it yet, but that quiet moment on the edge of his bed is the beginning of a different timeline. Not because his circumstances have changed, but because his relationship with them has. And once observation shifts, reality can no longer remain the same. Over the following days, nothing on the surface appears different for Michael. His calendar is still full. His inbox still fills faster than he can empty it. His responsibilities haven't disappeared. But something subtle has changed in how he meets each moment. He begins to notice how often his body tightens before anything actually happens, how his breath shortens the instant he anticipates pressure, how his mind jumps ahead, rehearsing outcomes that haven't occurred yet. For the first time, he isn't trying to correct these patterns. He's simply observing them. This is where the realization begins to form, not as an idea, but as a felt truth. Michael starts to see that his stress isn't created by events. It's created by how he meets events. The tension doesn't start with an email or a conversation. It starts with a contraction inside him, a subtle bracing against life before life has even arrived. And that contraction has been his default way of observing the world for years. One afternoon, while sitting in traffic, he catches himself doing it again. Jaw clenched, shoulders raised, breath shallow, his mind narrating the delay as a problem, an obstacle, a threat to his already tight schedule. And then he remembers that quiet moment on the edge of his bed. He doesn't force calm. He doesn't repeat a mantra. He simply notices the breath, the tension, the impulse to resist. And in noticing, something loosens. This is the moment Michael begins to understand what has been happening all along. He hasn't been responding to reality. He's been predicting it over and over again from the same internal posture. And each time, reality has obediently confirmed his expectations. Not because it's cruel, but because it's coherent. He realizes something unsettling. He's been living as if the future is something to brace for, not something to meet. His observation has been rooted in defense, in subtle fear, in the assumption that something will go wrong if he doesn't stay alert. And that assumption has been shaping everything: his conversations, his decisions, his sense of self. Even his sense of time feels compressed, rushed, always just behind. This is where the loop becomes visible. Observation shapes emotion. Emotion reinforces perception. Perception collapses the same outcomes. And those outcomes then feel like proof that nothing ever changes. Michael sees now that the loop isn't external, it's internal. And more importantly, it's optional. He starts experimenting, not with new actions, but with new observation. Before meetings, he pauses for a few breaths, not to calm himself, but to notice how he's entering the space. Is he observing from tension or from presence before responding to messages? He notices the impulse to rush, to justify, to control. Sometimes he still reacts, often he doesn't. And each time he chooses observation over reaction. Something surprising happens. The moment feels less heavy, less predetermined. One evening, he sits at his kitchen table after dinner, lights dim, phone untouched. He watches his thoughts arise, the familiar concerns about money, progress, whether he's doing enough. But now, instead of following them, he sees them as patterns passing through awareness. He notices how each thought carries a corresponding sensation in his body. Tightness, heat, pressure. And he notices something else. When he doesn't feed those sensations with judgment or urgency, they dissolve on their own. This is when the deeper realization lands. He is not his thoughts. He is not his emotional reactions. He is the awareness witnessing them. And that awareness feels stable in a way his thinking never has. Calm, spacious, unhurried. From this place, his life doesn't look like a problem to solve. It looks like a process unfolding. Michael begins to understand why all his previous attempts at change failed. They were all efforts to rearrange the surface while the observer remained the same. New habits layered onto the same internal stance. New goals pursued from the same nervous system state. He was trying to create a different future while observing from the past. This is where the observer effect begins to explain something Michael had never been able to name before. In physics, a system behaves differently depending on how it is observed, not because it is forced to change, but because observation itself is an interaction. Michael sees now that his awareness has been interacting with his life in a very specific way, quietly reinforcing familiarity over possibility. Michael begins to understand that his awareness has been functioning in the same way. He hasn't been standing outside his life, neutrally watching events unfold. His attention, emotional tone, and expectation have been part of the system itself. Every time he approached his work with tension, his future with anxiety, or himself with quiet self-doubt, that state of observation acted like a measurement. It collapsed experience into outcomes that matched the emotional conditions of the observer. This explains why none of his previous efforts produced lasting change. He kept altering behaviors while the observer's stance remained unchanged. New strategies were layered onto the same nervous system state. New intentions were filtered through the same anticipatory stress. And because the observer didn't change, the system didn't either. Reality wasn't resisting him. It was remaining coherent with the signal it was receiving. From a scientific perspective, this coherence makes sense. The brain and nervous system are prediction machines. They continuously scan for patterns they recognize as familiar and safe. Michael's body had learned to trust pressure, urgency, and control, even though those states felt uncomfortable. They were known, and known states collapse faster than unfamiliar ones. His observation consistently selected from a narrow band of probability that felt predictable to his system, reinforcing the same results again and again. What shifts now is not his circumstances, but his position within them. Michael realizes that observation happens before action, before choice, before outcome. It is the internal posture from which life is met. And until that posture changes, effort alone cannot produce a different reality. The observer effect reveals that change doesn't begin with doing something new. It begins with observing from a different state. And once he sees this, he can't unsee it. The explanation doesn't stay in his mind. It settles into his body. One night, lying in bed, he feels something he hasn't felt in years. Space, not the absence of problems, but the absence of pressure. He realizes that for the first time, he isn't trying to get somewhere else. He's fully here, watching his breath rise and fall, watching thoughts come and go, watching sensations move through him. And in that watching, he feels a quiet sense of control that doesn't come from force. This is the turning point, not a breakthrough moment, not a dramatic shift, but a recognition. The power to change his life doesn't live in effort. It lives in awareness, in the quality of attention he brings to each moment, in the way he observes before he acts. Michael doesn't yet know where this path will lead. But he knows this much. The version of reality he's been living in isn't fixed. It's been selected. And now, for the first time, he's learning how to select differently. The explanation doesn't stay in his mind. It settles into his body. And once it's felt in the body, it no longer stays personal. It points to something universal. What Michael is beginning to touch isn't philosophy. It isn't positive thinking. And it isn't spiritual bypassing. It's a principle that sits at the intersection of physics, biology, and lived experience. In science, it's often discussed through what's known as the observer effect. Not because awareness magically creates matter, but because systems behave differently depending on how they are engaged. In laboratory experiments, such as the double-slit experiment, particles are not described as fixed objects with predetermined paths. When no information is recorded about their trajectory, their behavior produces interference patterns consistent with wave-like probability distributions. When a measuring device is introduced to determine which path a particle takes, that interference disappears, and the system yields a single, localized outcome. The shift occurs because measurement introduces interaction and information into the system, changing the conditions under which it behaves. This discovery forced scientists to confront an uncomfortable truth. Observation is not passive. Awareness participates. And if that's true at the subatomic level, it raises an unavoidable question. What happens when a conscious human being observes their own life, their own body, their own future? Modern science is beginning to answer that question. Research from institutions like HeartMath shows that the human heart generates an electromagnetic field measurable several feet beyond the body. This field changes depending on emotional state and breath pattern. When someone is stressed, rushed, or anxious, the field becomes chaotic and incoherent. When someone is calm, present, and emotionally regulated, the field becomes ordered and coherent. And coherence isn't just a feeling. It's a measurable state that affects perception, decision-making, and how the nervous system communicates with the brain. This is where science and inner experience begin to converge. Because observation is never just mental, it's physiological. When you observe life through fear, your breath shortens, your muscles tighten, your nervous system shifts into protection mode. And in that state, your body sends a very specific signal into the field around you. A signal of contraction, of urgency, of defense. The field responds accordingly, not with intention or judgment, but with precision. Michael begins to understand that he hasn't just been thinking his way into the same outcomes. He's been breathing them into existence. His shallow breath, has been reinforcing a narrow field of attention. His constant alertness has been collapsing the same limited set of possibilities, not because better options weren't available, but because his state of observation wasn't a match for them. Ancient tradition spoke about this long before there were equations to describe it. They understood that breath was the bridge between consciousness and matter. In Sanskrit, it was called prana. In Hebrew, ruach. In Chinese medicine, qi. Different languages pointing to the same truth. Breath carries information, and the quality of that information shapes experience. When breath is unconscious, observation is unconscious. When breath becomes slow, deep, and intentional, awareness expands. The observer stabilizes. This is why mystics across cultures emphasized stillness, not as withdrawal from life, but as alignment with it. Stillness allows the observer to emerge without interference from reactive patterns. From this perspective, spirituality stops being abstract. It becomes mechanical. The observer effect isn't mystical because it involves consciousness. It's practical because consciousness is the interface. Observation determines which probabilities you interact with. Coherence determines which ones can sustain themselves in your experience. Michael sees now that reality isn't something he needs to force into change. It's something that reorganizes naturally when the observer becomes coherent, when awareness is steady, when breath is regulated, when attention is no longer scattered by fear or anticipation. The field begins to offer different responses. Conversations feel less tense. Decisions feel clearer. Timing feels less rushed. This doesn't mean life becomes perfect. It means life becomes responsive. Instead of pushing against circumstances, Michael finds himself listening to them. Instead of bracing for impact, he meets moments as they arrive. And in doing so, he begins to notice something almost unsettling. The world feels less rigid, less fixed, as if it's been waiting for him to stop interfering. The observer effect reveals a truth that both science and spirituality are circling from different angles. You don't create reality by controlling it. You participate in it by how you observe. And when observation becomes conscious, reality has no choice but to change. Reality does not respond to desire. It responds to conditions. So here's the real question. Do you simply understand this idea? Or is it shaping how you meet each moment of your life? Understanding the observer effect conceptually is one thing. Embodying it is something else entirely. This is where most people get lost. They turn insight into another mental project, another technique to perform, another way to measure progress. But conscious observation isn't something you do more of. It's something you allow. And the doorway into that allowance is remarkably simple. It's the body, and more specifically, the breath. Michael doesn't adopt a new ritual or a rigid schedule. He begins with moments, small, almost unnoticeable pauses woven into his day. Before opening his laptop, before answering a difficult message, before speaking when his chest feels tight. In those moments, he does just three things. He notices the breath, he notices the body, and he notices the impulse to react. He doesn't change the breath at first. He simply observes where it lives. Most of the time, it's high and shallow, barely touching his chest. That alone tells him something important. His nervous system is in prediction mode. It's scanning for what might go wrong. Seeing this without judgment is already a shift, because awareness interrupts automation. Then, gently, he allows the breath to drop lower. Not forcing it, not controlling it, just giving it permission to deepen. Inhale through the nose, slow exhale through the mouth. And between those two movements, he notices something most people never feel. A brief pause. A quiet gap. Not empty, just still. This is what physicists might call a transition state, and what mystics have always recognized as the place where choice becomes possible. In that gap, Michael isn't thinking about the past or projecting into the future. He's simply present, observing without labeling. And in that observation, the emotional charge around the situation begins to soften. Here's what's important. He's not using the breath to manifest an outcome. He's using it to stop collapsing the old one. That distinction changes everything. Instead of trying to replace fear with positivity, he allows fear to be seen without feeding it. Instead of trying to calm the mind, he becomes the awareness that notices the mind. When an uncomfortable sensation arises, tightness in the chest, pressure in the stomach, he doesn't push it away. He brings attention to it, breathing into the space around it, not to fix it, but to witness it, and as he does, the sensation often dissolves on its own, not because it was suppressed, but because it was fully observed. This is embodiment. The observer is no longer a concept. It's a lived position. Michael starts to recognize the difference between reacting from habit and responding from presence. Reaction feels fast, urgent, familiar. Response feels slower, clearer, quieter. And the more often he chooses observation before action, the more his baseline begins to shift. There's a moment one morning when an unexpected problem arises at work. Normally, this would have triggered immediate tension. But instead, Michael pauses. He feels his feet on the floor. He notices his breath. He observes the surge of stress without becoming it. And something surprising happens. The problem doesn't feel personal. It feels solvable. This is how practice works, not in isolation, but in life itself. Each pause strengthens the observer. Each conscious breath widens the field of available responses. Michael isn't trying to become someone new. He's simply allowing a different way of relating to what's already here. Over time, these moments add up. His sleep deepens. His body holds less tension. Conversations feel less charged. Not because the world has changed, but because his observation has. And as his observation stabilizes, reality begins to reorganize around it. Quietly, naturally, without force. This is what conscious observation looks like in practice. Not dramatic, not mystical, but profoundly effective. Because when the observer changes, the system must follow. Michael doesn't wake up one morning to a completely different life. There is no sudden windfall, no dramatic turning point, no moment where everything becomes perfect. But something far more important has changed. His life no longer feels like something happening to him. It feels like something responding to him. And that shift begins and ends with observation. This is the part most people never hear. Reality isn't shaped by what you want. It isn't moved by how hard you try. It reorganizes itself around the quality of your awareness, around how you observe when no one is watching, around the emotional and physiological state from which you meet each moment. The observer effect isn't a metaphor for hope. It's a mechanism of coherence. When you observe from tension, you collapse a tense world. When you observe from fear, you stabilize fearful outcomes. But when you observe from presence, when your breath is steady, your body grounded, and your attention no longer fragmented by anticipation, reality has access to a wider range of possibilities. Not because you earned them, but because you finally stopped excluding them. Michael's story isn't unique. It's ordinary. And that's what makes it powerful. He didn't change his life by becoming more disciplined or more positive. He changed it by becoming more present, by noticing the moment before reaction, by allowing awareness to lead instead of habit. And in doing so, he stepped out of the loop that had been quietly repeating for years. This is the invitation for you as well. You don't need to add anything to your life. You don't need a new belief system or a more elaborate practice. You need a different relationship with your attention. Begin by noticing how you're observing. Notice your breath. Notice the posture of your body. Notice whether you're meeting life from contraction or from openness. The next time you feel stuck, don't ask what you should do. Ask how you're looking. Ask what state your observer is in. And then pause long enough for that state to shift. Because the moment you stop forcing reality, you give it room to respond. The observer effect teaches us something both humbling and liberating. You are not separate from the world you're trying to change. You are the consciousness through which it's being shaped. Every moment you choose awareness over reaction. You participate consciously in that shaping. So take a breath, not to calm down, not to fix anything, just to notice. Let that noticing become your new baseline, and watch what begins to reorganize around you. Because when conscious observation changes, reality has no choice but to follow.